And the author of that piece, Patsy McGarry, joins us now from Ireland. Patsy, great to be with you today. So for those who may not be aware, tell us a little bit more about the current state of the Catholic Church in Ireland. I understand your article notes, for instance, that there are only 21 bishops for 26 dioceses.
Yeah, well, in the Catholic world, that's quite a lot for a small population. Approximately on the whole island of Ireland, we have about 4.5 million Catholics. We have 26 dioceses, now, which go back over 1,000 years to 1111, actually, to a synod that took place that year, followed up by another one in 1152, which consolidated what we have today as there were 36 dioceses. There are now 26 in the Catholic world. And you look at the biggest diocese in the United States, which is the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. It is about slightly over 4 million Catholics, yet it has one cardinal archbishop and 6 auxiliary bishops. We currently in Ireland have 21 bishops in diocese and 3 auxiliary bishops, which is quite a lot for a small country and for a comparatively small Catholic church in terms of overall population. It faces the same problems a lot of Catholic churches do throughout the Western world: declining priest numbers, declining numbers of clergy available to become bishops. The average age of the Irish Catholic priest today is about 72, 73. If they're in religion, as in members of a religious order or congregation, is 74, 75. So literally they're dying out. They retire at 75. So there is a personnel issue as well. But for a long time, there has been talk in Ireland about rationalising the number of our dioceses. For instance, the Church of Ireland, which would be like your Episcopal Church, had the same basic diocesan framework as the Catholic Church had in Ireland up to the Reformation period, obviously. It has reduced its number of dioceses to 11. Even last year, there had been 12. Last year, others were consolidated into what is the 11th diocese, which takes up approximately a third of the island of Ireland. Now, the Anglican population here is comparatively small. In the Republic, it's about 3% of the population. But still, it's an indication of where our template for the Catholic Church when it comes to downsizing. If it's to be effective, it needs to downsize. It doesn't have the clergy numbers anymore. And on top of that, practice has gone down significantly to about late 20s, early 30s%, which would be about the average for most European countries. Very unusual for Ireland, where 40 years ago, up to 93% of people attended weekly Mass, of Catholic people, that is.
Yeah, and Patsy, how are the faithful and church leaders, how are they responding to the restructuring? Are they concerned?
The Catholic bishops themselves have been concerned for some time about the decline of vocations overall, and this is one of their measures they're adopting to deal with that. I mean, there will be more. I mean, in the west of Ireland, what we've had, there were 6 dioceses which would be reduced to 3. Now, it is the least populous part of Ireland, with just over 460,000 Catholics, compared to 1.1 million in the Dublin Archdiocese alone. Most Catholics in Ireland, like most of the population, is on the east coast of the island. So it needs to restructure. It needs to get away from the old system, which was designed for very different times over 1,000 years ago, when many dioceses were structured on tribal lines to combat Viking raids. For instance, every diocese had to have access to the sea, whether it be the actual Atlantic itself or the Irish Sea to the east, or to a big river like the Shannon as a way of escape. I mean, things have changed considerably since then. And indeed, there's been an argument for a long time for having lesser dioceses, and the process really has just begun. We want to see much more radical change, I do believe myself, of necessity in the years ahead, a gradual greater reduction of the number of bishops and therefore the number of dioceses.
Patsy, you had mentioned previously about the number of Catholics dwindling, or practicing Catholics dwindling in Ireland. Do you know what's contributing to that?
Well, there are a number of factors, some of which, indeed many of which, you'd be very familiar with yourselves in the United States. Decline had set in the later part of the 1970s. Probably a big two contributing factors to that would have been greater access to education. In 1967, the government introduced free education right up to and including third level for people who reached a certain number of points in their final high school exams, and they would be paid for by the state. That still exists today. And then you had the relaxation which followed the Vatican II, Second Vatican Council, and in a measure of prosperity. And all of these began to lead to a dwindling away from what had been huge social practice Now, how much of it was based on religion is another matter, of people attending liturgies on a very, very regular basis here in Ireland. Ireland was an outlier in the whole Catholic world in the numbers of people who used to attend Mass on Sundays weekly, for instance. That process had begun, but then the enormous, shocking abuse scandals had a huge and deeply profound effect on the ordinary Irish Catholic faithful, the people in the parishes. They couldn't believe that bishops would oversee such things or try to hide such things or would put the institution before the protection of children, for instance. And even today, there is deep lingering suspicion of authority in the Catholic Church in Ireland. And what has retained any hold it has on the people, it comes down to the ordinary priest or nun on the ground in the parish with whom most Catholics at that level would have a close personal relationship. They trust them, but they do not trust their superiors, and they have every good reason for not trusting their superiors, as 6 state reports to date, and there's another pending, have illustrated the same pattern again, the cover-up of the abuse of children to protect the church from scandal and to protect its assets, including its priests. It is a damning indictment of what that institution had become. Now, there had been radical reform in recent years. I would have to say, having observed the church very closely over the best part of 3 decades, probably the safest place for a child in Ireland today is in church grounds, because they have a very rigorous child safeguarding regulations in place, monitored mainly by women, mothers frequently, and they do insist on sticking to child protection regulations very, very rigorously, and that has helped on the ground. But overall, the abuse scandals, combined with the other things I talked about, has led to a falling away of the old loyal attitude of many Irish Catholics to the church in general.
Patsy, do you see any signs that maybe things are improving on that end? Any sign of hope for the Catholic Church and maybe sort of a revival in these numbers?
Well, what's happening is a reversion in practice to patterns before the famine period in Ireland, when there were very, very few priests, for instance, because they were persecuted by the administration of the time. They weren't allowed to say masses, etc. Catholics weren't allowed to practice under the penal laws. They weren't allowed in education. They weren't allowed to join the professions. They were a heavily persecuted majority, because the majority of people on this island at the time were Catholic. 10% were not. But the 10% had control under the British government at the time. Catholics were heavily persecuted at that time. So before the famine period, for Catholic emancipation in 1829, there were few priests, but people practiced in the home. Most sacraments were prepared for in the home. Funerals took place out of the home, involving mainly lay people. There would be irregular masses because priests weren't regularly available, and these masses would take place often out in the open, penal rocks, etc. And we are going back to, we're not going back to penal rocks, but we're going back to that level of irregular practice, and with more emphasis, if you like, on a personal faith. Old traditional pilgrimages are being revived. Patrons, they were called, named after the patron saint of a locality. All those things which were changed and got rid of after the famine in a new form of Catholicism in Ireland are being revived. As well as that, there's a newer type of bishop being appointed. They tend to be more progressive, much closer to the people, to use the phrase of Pope Francis. They smell of the sheep. They're less authoritarian. They're more consultative. They're more synodal, if you like, where the people are concerned. And that is improving things generally where the church is concerned. But it has a long, long road back. And the form of church we're familiar with in Ireland is gone. What will replace it will be something very, very different, much more people-oriented, much more people-centred, where the people will have much more authority, including in ministry, whether it be the conduct of baptisms, the conduct of funerals, the conduct of weddings, as is happening in parts of Europe already. That's going to happen here in Ireland too. The laity are going to play a much, much greater role in the administration of parishes and indeed in the ministry in parishes.
Well, Patsy McGarry of the Irish Times, thank you so much for your time and your insights. We appreciate it. God bless.
You're very welcome, Tracy. Bye-bye.